Okay, so let's start. How is it with the labs? How many of you finished the labs already? Are you on the second one? Finished second or on the second? Okay. Oh, come on, the first one was not that hard. Okay, so you have 3 weeks left. The second one is not hard, but it can have some gotchas. Some of the students already have some issues. The third one should be quite straightforward. And then the fourth one, yeah, may have some gotchas as well. So don't leave it for the last minute. What I prepared today is 2 things. So one is the continuation of the discussion yesterday about the sensors, and I can spend some time. Showing the GPS location services access. Would you like to have it, or is it simple enough that we should not spend time on it? So who would like to see how to use location services and doing the location altitude? Okay, so let's do that. It should not take too long. The second part is Firebase. Firebase is a kind of a big topic. It covers various aspects of what Firebase offers. We're using Firebase as an example. You can substitute it with a different framework which does the same things, although the one which Google offers is pretty much the best which is available at the moment. But the concepts are not unique to Firebase. You can have a different backends. So it's similar to the cloud where we use like Google or Amazon. Oh no, we use Google or Heroku as an examples. So Firebase is again kind of one of those infrastructures which offer you some services. And the point is not to learn Firebase as such, just to use Firebase to learn the concepts, because the concepts are quite good. But let's do the, if we were to do the sensors first, let's do the sensors. I was doing the Firebase example yesterday, and I thought I'm gonna do it in Kotlin, and I will show you. I wrote like 3 lines of code, and I decided, okay, it's too hard. Because we would have to change. I hope I didn't delete it. No, it's an Android Studio. It's not IntelliJ. Yeah, that's right. So the wrong tool for the job. Android Studio. All right, so how many of you know functional programming? A little bit. So I started doing Kotlin, and it is not a functional programming framework, but yeah, so this one. Yep. Fonts. So as you see, I haven't written much. Where was the colors and fonts? Yeah, I should do. Okay, so we have so we have a normal class activity. We have 3 fields. We have the authentication manager and the user text view and the chat kind of list view. And as you see, there is kind of this magical question mark at the end. So if I were, you see, if I were to get a display name from the current user, it sort of says you cannot. And if I do that, it will also complain. So where is this magical question mark? Have you used like CoffeeScript in JavaScript? So by declaring it with the question mark, I'm basically saying this field can be either have a value of that type, or it can fail to have that value of that type. So it could be null, right? If I don't do this question mark, it can only have value of that type and it can never be null. So you have to initialize it, and it cannot be non-initialized, and it cannot have null. If with the question mark it can. So then if you say, okay, my text view has a text field, because in Kotlin you substitute things like, in Java we would say set text, right? And then we would have some sort of string which we pass. But that's in Java, that's kind of a property. So if you have setters and getters, this is sort of like a property that you can assign value to or read value from. And in Kotlin, you don't use properties with setters and getters. You basically use them by the dot notation on the properties directly. So anything in Java that has get or set method and then something, like, in text view, we have set text. So the text become the name of the property that this type has. And in Kotlin, we use the properties instead of setters and getters. And because this is a Java type, it kind of behind the scenes get converted. But as you see, it complains here. It says it might be too small to read, but it says smart cast to text view is impossible because this TV is a mutable property that could have, changed by this time. So it's like it doesn't know what it is because it's a mutable property, and it could be null, right? So then we have to say, okay, actually we do this, and then it is happy, because if this is null, this is not gonna happen, right? It will basically not run this line if the first thing is null. So it kind of guards you from having null pointer exceptions by passing something that potentially could be null and guarding it with this kind of a question mark. But it's, that's already quite difficult to grasp, and it has to do with kind of applicative functions on boxed values, right? So here we have a text view which is wrapped around kind of a box, which prevents you to be doing something on it if it doesn't have a value, because it could have null inside, right? So this will only run if the TV user is not null, and so on. So I decided, okay, maybe explaining all this functional stuff is not what we should be focusing on. We should be focusing on the just going ahead with the sensor and Firebase work. So yesterday we have started doing the sensors, and we designed a simple app which has read the temperature and the pressure from the two sensors. Yeah.
On the screen, only 2/3 of the screen is actually visible.
Oh yes, good point. Thanks for pointing that out. I've noticed that between this classroom and the other classroom, the projector tells the OBS different dimensions for what, yeah. So if I don't correct it, then it's broken. So let me do it justice. I haven't noticed, although I have it on my screen here. I should notice. Okay, should be better now. Okay, so yesterday we started doing reading from two sensors, and we have a layout which tells us the two sensor values for the temperature and for the pressure, and we are approximating what's the altitude based on the pressure, assuming that the pressure on the sea level is 1013 hectopascals. We can yeah, I will put the code into the repository after the class, so the existing code base will be there. We need to add, I don't know why it's not refreshing, but sometimes you have those glitches. So let's see if it will work now. Yep. So we have the pressure-based altitude, and we would like to add an additional field for the GPS-based altitude. So I will copy that. So we have the additional field, and copy that. So we have additional field as well. And we will change. So let's see where it added those two things. Is this one. And is this one. We would say pressure by GPS. No, altitude by GPS. So we have the, oops, we've missed this one. Yeah, we need two of those. I didn't really copy that. So we'll have altitude by GPS. Yeah, actually, altitude by GPS should be here, and this one should be here. All right, so we have an additional text view that we can grab and put the altitude by GPS here, and the old one, altitude by pressure, is still there. So we've added additional element to the UI. So now we have to modify our setup sensors to grab the altitude by GPS. So we will introduce additional text view that we can interact with, and it will be altitude by GPS. Also, when I was doing Kotlin example, it was whining about me not using the proper camel case for the variables. So as you see, I'm using camel case here and not using camel case here. It's a bad style, right? So we should probably refactor those things. So we will rename the TV pressure to be TV pressure. And you should always do refactoring by IDE, because if I change the name here, if I just delete those two things and do this, I will have problems later in code which says, oh yeah, we don't know what this is, right? So the best way to deal with that is don't manipulate your variable names by hand. Just right click on it, say refactor, and refactor your code. So we need to change it to, whoops, to temperature. Come on. Something went broke. Refactor, rename. Temperature, refactor, rename. Okay, this is a bit long name. Any suggestions? So altitude. It's not altitude pressure. Yeah, let's keep it altitude by pressure. And the new one, because the new one is not used anywhere, we can change it manually. Altitude by GPS. Okay, in naming conventions, when you are using different languages, they kind of force you to use different conventions for the acronyms. And in Java and in most languages, you actually should do this. So like, you know, URL is not done as URL, but usually as URL. But there are some inconsistencies, right? So if we see here, it's all caps, right? In standard .NET library. But, well, it's a matter to be consistent. So if your coding conventions dictate you should use caps for acronyms, then you should use caps, but otherwise you should kind of lowercase it. So it's the same for JSON. You see, in standard libraries, most of it is caps, but Android util, the JSON is done like this. So in this library, org.json, the acronyms are capitalized, but in Android, it's lower case for the remaining letters. Minor point. So we will do this here. Okay, so camel case for fields. How about the GPS? How about this? Is it fine to use underscores? Yeah, it's fine. Most of the coding conventions don't apply to the identifiers inside the XML. And it's kind of good to be case insensitive inside the XML. All right, so we have linked our altitude by GPS. Now we just need to get it. So similarly to getting the environmental sensors, we have to get the location manager and register a callback, which will give us the updates about the location. So we need additional private field called location manager, and let's call it location manager, and we will in similar fashion of getting the sensor service, we will get the location manager. So, you know, I know some things, but if you don't know things, you just look them up. So if we just browse Android developer location manager, we can get to the docs and check so it clearly says here you have a location manager, and it says instances of this class must be obtained using context get system service class with the argument being location manager class, or string being a location service, right? So, well, we basically need to copy that bit. Okay, what's context? Context is this sort of a pattern where we have some sort of a class or set of classes, and we managing some sort of a wrapper, some sort of context for that application. And it just happens that activity is itself a context, right? So I could say inside here, I could say get context. So I can get the application context and I can get the base context, but I also usually have access from the main thread, from the activity, to the context of where this activity is currently in. So if I say get system service, it knows about that call. So this call is on the context interface, but activity implements that interface, so I have it here. And then we just need to pass the string. and we need to import the context. And it says, well, you need to cast it. So, okay. So now we have a reference to LocationManager. And as we were discussing yesterday, there is a call called request location updates, which you can use with this version, which is using the minimum time for the updates, the distance, and some other criteria. So let's pick the one which we really want to use. We probably want this one because we don't need to be dealing with the looper. We don't want kind of a intent to deal with. We only want to register the listener. So let's have a look how this one looks like. So this one takes a provider, and the call, like we can obtain the location manager without asking the user for permissions. But to ask for the location updates, it says, okay, requires access course location or access find location permissions, right? So we have to deal with the permissions somehow. We have to ask the user for the permissions. So what would be good is for us to find an example of how we're supposed to get the location updates. So let's again have a short query. So we will say Android location manager request location updates example. We kind of we have the Stack Overflow, we have the reference to the location manager, we have some tutorials. That's not what we really want. We really want the preferably developer android.com docs. Right, so we have location strategies. That looks promising. So let's see that. Cool. So requesting location updates, we could read the whole thing, and you should read the whole thing. But if you're really pressured for time, we've done this. So now we need to have our listener. We will do it in a moment. And then they use a network provider, right? So here we are specifying which provider we're gonna use as a source of information for our location updates. And you can use the GPS provider instead of network provider, and that is probably better because the GPS will be much more accurate than the network-based, especially for the altitude. The network-based are not too bad for the latitude and longitude, but they still give you the course, not fine. If we were to find a fine location, using the GPS provider is the way to do it. So we can kind of copy that up to here. So same as we were doing with the other listeners, we will say this location manager request location updates. Actually, we've copied that, so boom. No, we didn't copy the name. Request location updates. Okay, and the final thing will be the listener. So again, we have an option of doing inline, like we did here with the anonymous inner class. But as we discussed yesterday, it already cluttered our setup sensors method. So putting an anonymous inner class here is probably not what we want. So we will define a new class. So because I can put null here, so the compiler is kind of happy. Oh, it's not happy. Let's comment that out before we do this. So I will have another class here, which will say GPS listener, and we will implement and we have to check what is the type that location listener. So the type is location listener. So we'll say implements location listener. And we do this, and we're missing implementation methods, which the location listener needs to have. So we right-click, generate, and we say implement methods that are missing. And we're missing 4 methods. So we have to implement 4 methods. One is on location changed, and it gives us the actual location of what the new location is. And then there are 3 more. One is on the status change, and then on the provider enabled and disabled. What are those? So the first one is similar to the call which we used to have with the environmental sensors, which was the accuracy changed, right? Every time accuracy changes, or every time the more satellites are visible, or every time something happens to the GPS or to the location manager in that case, we will get an event. So we can handle it here. So we can say, okay, if the accuracy is too low, we let the user know that we still don't have it, or whatever that is. So you can handle the status changes by dealing with this callback here, right? So tracking the accuracy or change in GPS signal strength, what have you. Those two are when the user decides to disable or enable GPS. So when the user decides to disable GPS, this will be called. And when the user decides to enable GPS, this will be called. So even if the user grants you the permission to use GPS, the user can still go and disable GPS. And even though you have permission to use it, it's disabled now and you cannot use it, right? So you have to deal with it in those 2 methods. So when the user disables the GPS, well, you have to do something. So, here we have to say to do deal with the user disabling GPS. And then reverse is when the user enables it here, right? So for time being, we're not gonna deal with it. What we're gonna do in the location changed? Well, we're gonna do as we were doing before, but without the test if the value changed, because we will be guaranteed that we only will get updates when things change, okay? We will not be called when nothing changes. So here we will say TV, altitude by GPS, set text, and we will say location. And then we have get altitude, which returns a double. And we can turn it into a string by doing quotes being added to the empty string. Is this method of turning something into a string a good way of turning something to a string? No, it's not. What would be a better way? Yes, so, okay, we could do this. Let's do it. To string. Is it better? No, because double doesn't have a to string. It's a double. So tough luck. Okay, so that one is out. What else can we do? You can cast to string. Well, can you really cast double to string?
If you have the static double class, you can use this.
It says inconvertible cannot cast double to string. Come on. Okay. Yes, so it has parse double, which takes the string. We actually have a string which we have a double which we want to turn into string. So we have to call toString and pass it this, right? So we're missing one closing bracket. So now if I compare, okay, let's copy that. So we had the original one. Okay. So which one is better? The bottom one is more idiomatic. It actually tells you what is happening. It tells you that you have the double, and it's being turned into string by this call. The first one actually does the latter one behind the scenes, right? So this is going to happen if I do the first one, with the difference that it also will add an empty string to it in the beginning, right? So the first one is exactly the same as the second one with an extra operation, which, you know, is undesirable because adding empty string to something means nothing, right? Which one is easier to read? The top one. I mean, we have to be, you know, we have to be pragmatic. And the first one is easier to read, right? It's a little bit useless to do this empty thing, but it's kind of more easier to read. And there is an additional thing about the first one. The additional thing about the first one is that we often have that. Okay, we often see that. So we have something, some methods or something, which takes two parameters, and it takes a parameter which needs to be a string, and it is something like, you know, some sort of variable, right? So if I do this, and the variable is an object most of the time. So normally what you could do is you could say toString, right, instead of the upper one. So you could do this. So if, okay, let's rename it because I cannot refer to it. So let's f. F takes a string. F expects a string. Variable is an object, it's not a string. So I could do this or I could do this. Behind the scene, the first one will do this as well, with the caveat that if variable is null, this one will throw a runtime exception, whereas the first one will print string which has null inside it. The first one will not throw a runtime exception. It will try to do this if variable is not null, but if variable is null, it will basically return this string which is null, whereas that one will either so it either returns the string of the variable, whatever the variable string is, or it throws if variable is null, right? So in a sense, this piece of code is a little bit safer because it will never throw, even if variable is null. It will just tell you, it will pass the string which is null, which may or may not be desirable behavior, right? You may want to throw. If something is null, you may say, no, it should never be null. We should throw. But, you know, in that case, before you do this, you have to say if variable is not null, do this. If it is null, deal with it, right? So it gets a bit complicated with this error handling and everything. And you often see people doing this for the reason that it will not throw. And if I have a UI and I'm printing something and it prints null here, the app still runs. It's just that I know, okay, so, you know, I was reading a record from a database and it is null, so I see it, it's null, but it doesn't throw, it doesn't kill the app, right? So sometimes killing the app is not desirable. You don't want to kill the app. So you will see code like this. And because you will see code like this, you also see code like this, because This happens behind the scene. We cannot throw here. I mean, this is a safe code no matter what. This is a safe code no matter what, because double will have a value. It cannot be null. It has to have a value, right? But you know, from the programming style, you will see code like this line. You will see code like this line much more often than code like this line. So, but if we are pedantic and if we say, well, we don't want to do this extra plus on the nothingness, we will leave this, right? And it's fine too. It's just one liner and it's not as hard to parse it mentally neither, right? So I would say fine. Okay, so this will print, this will add the location by GPS to our UI. Now we have to do this bit. So we have to say, okay, now we have to put this listener here. So let's call it location listener. And in fact, you know, we can instantiate it directly here. So we called it GPS listener, and off we go. Right, so this line is fine, but this line is red. And if I highlight it, it says, missing permission required by LocationManager, request location updates. Android permission access course location and find location are needed, right? So can I fix it? So can I generate no, I don't think so. Can I go to, come on. It's a very long line and my mouse cannot go off from it. Ah, okay, I don't have a mouse. Yep, let's try it. Yep, so it just says what I need to do, but it doesn't tell me, it doesn't allow me to generate that piece of code directly. So it says missing permission. This check scans through your code and libraries and looks for the APIs being used without having those permissions in. So, well, we have to, what's that? Okay. Let's try it. Add permissions, great, fantastic. Thanks for the hint. So we can add course location and find location. It says or, okay? Which one we want? We want the find location. The course means the provider can be a network or can be something that gives you approximate location. If we use find, we will get more accurate reading. So let's do this. Come on, have you done it? Nope. Exactly. Let's double check it. So it does edit, and it does edit twice, which is nonsense. So as of, I think, Android 6, you have two types of dealing with permissions. The older APIs will read the manifest file when the APK is being loaded. They will scan the manifest file, and when the user is installing the app will ask the user for granting the app the permissions which are in the manifest file, right? So you've seen it sometimes when you install the app, and the app kind of asks you, okay, before you install it, do you grant all those permissions to the app, right? And those permissions are read from the manifest file. And that happens always for the old APIs. For the new APIs, you can basically delete that from the manifest and then don't ask the users for the permission during the installation process. So when the user installs the app from the Google Play, there will be no permission requests, but the app will ask the user the permissions the very first time you need to do something with GPS. So you will ask the user the permission from inside the app itself, right? So we can either ask the user for the permissions up front here, or we can ask the users for the permissions later. Because we're compiling this app with the new APIs, this kind of will be ignored, right? So for the new phones, this check will be ignored and the user can install our app even without granting the permission. For the phones which have the older Android, this will be used and the user will be asked for the permissions on the installation phase. But it doesn't solve our problem for the new APIs. It only solves the problem for the old APIs. So in here, we have to do something to make sure that this line is not read anymore. And if we let's see what this is. No. So I basically have to do it manually. I don't think the IDE will kind of do it for me. Say it again? Great, thanks again. So here we have this auto-generated blob of code, which says, which is pretty tedious to write by hand. Yes, so what happens is we have to take our line of code, copy that. And what happens here is it checks if we have, so it checks if we have been granted the access find location permissions. If we were not granted the permissions, so it says, we are not granted, then it will quit at that point. Nothing else will happen in this method, right? So I now have a method in the buffer, which I have to paste somewhere because I don't want to type it again. But I have to move this. So let's move it to the end of this method. And if we were not granted the permission, we have to ask the user for the permission. If we were granted the permission, so I say, okay, else we've been given the permission. No, whoops, not this one. Then I can do this. I can request the but in here, we have to deal with the case where we're checking if we were granted the permission, and the answer is no, we haven't been granted, right? And it could be for two reasons. We never asked, or we've asked and we've been denied, right? So yeah, and neither of that is true. So the help here suggests, okay, consider calling activity compat request permissions to request the missing permission. And then we will have the callback on request permission result, which will have, the result for us, right? So it's a little bit complexity that we have to add to manage the granting and handling the permissions. So we will kind of follow the suggestion. We don't have to return. If we do return, the last line is not gonna be executed. So according to the rules of skipping else statements, we can kind of do this because this is only gonna happen if we had the permissions. Otherwise, we're gonna return at that point. And here we're gonna do request permissions, and we have to ask for it takes an array. String array of permissions plus kind of the indicator which will link us back to the request code here. So in the string, we have to say we need find location. And let's say 0. So this is the new string array. Yeah, and this turns out not to be, yeah, this is string, but we need an int. Okay, let me just check the signatures of the so we need Android request permission. Yep. Yep. Request permission method, and the method takes. It should take. A string array. So maybe this is an int. That's what you're saying. Well,
is the size of the array.
Yeah, size of string array, and then you use the inline specification using curly braces for the elements.
Yep, you're right. So we just do this. You're right. Well, that shouldn't matter. Because the size should be inferred by the elements. So the problem is not with the size. The problem is, yeah, how did we? Let me see. Yeah, let's see here. Manifest permissions. Yeah, let's search for it. What is it? Access, find location. So manifest, Android manifest permission is a string. No, the last one is just int. Yeah, well, let's try. So let's try to have a string array.
This should be an array of ints. Not an array.
Possibly. Let's do this and see if this guy likes the string array. Because what we are probably doing something wrong here is with the syntax of the string array. If that is not liked, then yes, that's not liked. And that's liked. So we've messed up. Initially, we've messed up the inlining of those two lines of code, right? So let's work it out. Let's work out again what we need to say. So we have to say new string array, that's for sure. And then we have to initialize something, right? And that works. So this should work as well. Okay, I mean, I thought we had it before, but maybe it was messed up because I did this here. Yeah. So now it's fine. The method signature is it takes an array of strings followed by the code which we have to use to kind of decipher the on request permission result, right? So then we have to have this method, which we will put here. So it will be a public. It's already there. So we will say, okay, there is a method which will be called back when the user decides or not to grant us the permission. So it has and we probably should say over. It has this request code, right, which will match the one which we called here, because we can ask a user for multiple permissions multiple times. We can call request permission more than once. And if we do that, we can change this request code and dispatch which one we got the callback from. So this first parameter lays out what we did to what comes back, because it is a callback method, right? So this call will call us back when the user decides whether to give us the permission or not. And then we can, because we're doing it once and we're only doing it for the location, I can ignore that code, right? So I said 0, but I don't need really to check here if the request code is 0. But for the sanity check, let's say if request code is not 0, then I will return, right? So I will not actually do anything if I got callback from something else later in my code. It has two problems. I should use curly braces, and also I shouldn't use the magic numbers, right? So I should sort of declare some constant which I use to kind of do this. But yeah, let's say I'm a little bit lazy and the code can be then refactored. So then I have the permissions and I have the grant results. So for those permissions, I have those results, right? Let's check the method is called onRequestPermissionResult. OnRequestPermissionResult. And we will find onRequestPermissionResult callback. So I just want to make sure that we interpreting the results correctly. So callback for the results from requesting permissions. This method is invoked, blah, blah, blah. And then the ints permissions, the requested permissions, never null, and the int, the grant result for the corresponding. So is it either permission granted or permission denied, right? Because we're asking just for one permission, so this will be an array of 1, and this will be an array of 1. So I have to check if grant results of 0 is equal, and then I have to say 1 of is equal permission granted. So I will do this. And this one is inside package manager. Well, let's hope it will find what I mean. Permission granted. It finds it. So I will permission checker. So there are two permission granted constants. One is from the compatibility library, and because I'm using the app compat, I probably should be using that one. So if we were granted the permission, I can now do this line, right? So if the user granted us a permission, I can register the yes. Yep. So I get what you're saying. It's just that I will suppress that warning here because I am guaranteed that my permission has been granted by the logic of the code. Make sense? It smells, right? So we're doing something wrong. The pattern kind of doesn't feel exactly correct. But, you know, for the time being, let's test it. So let's run it. We can always refactor it. We can always, you know, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. So let's change it. Good. While it's loading. Woohoo, I could move the window. I cannot restart it yet because it's still building. We will see whether it builds with the updated version of the code or not. So while it's doing its thing, let us go back here and ask the Android developers reference request permission. If we, yeah, I have to delete that bit. So usually in the so we can check yeah, so they do the request and then well, so we sort of do the same thing. As I said, we do ignore the request code because we know it's only one. For the grant results, they do check if it's more than 0. We don't. We probably should check because in case, you know, we get the call. I mean, with the value 0, we shouldn't get we should have at least 1, but we should check it. And the block they kind of showing here doesn't show the actual request. So, you know, the error which we are getting is probably because of the IDE. We're doing exactly the same, yeah.
When you don't get a permission for something, should you store that result yourself, or should you just ask the permission system whether you have to permission? Like say for example next time you pick it up.
Yeah, exactly. So that is a good point. So in our logic currently, what happens is we only doing it once on the initial startup of the app, right? So basically we firing up the app. we asking the user for the permissions. If the app is run for the second time and they've already granted us the permission, this check will return true. So I mean, will return false. Will return false because we've been granted, right? So then this will run, and then nothing happens. If we're running the app for the first time, the pop-up will show up, and the user will be asked, okay, do you want to grant the find location permissions or not? And if the user says yes, we register the callback, and the app will remember the answer. If the user says no, we will not run this callback, and we just let it go. Like, we don't ask the user again. So then the app will have the first two fields being updated, and the location, the altitude by GPS will not work. Will basically say hello world, right? It will never register the callback. And when the user starts the phone one more time, then we back here. So the user will be asked for the permissions again, right? So our flow currently is, we ask the user once at the beginning. If the user says yes, we never ask again. If the user says no, we ask the user again. And if the user says yes, closes the app, and then goes to the preferences and says no in the config of the Android that this app cannot use location, we ask again when the app opens. Yeah.
Okay, so you have to store the value manually if you want it.
No, the framework stores it.
Yeah, but if you want it, like, if you don't want to ask it several times, if you say no one time, it won't ask the next time, then you have to do that yourself.
That's correct, but the framework stores it as well. So I will. There was because you will know if the user said no once already. So there is a flag. You can ask the permission system whether you've already asked once, right? And if you didn't, it's kind of a new, because like that's what they say here. Yes, here. So there is a call called should show. Yeah, let's check this one. So this will return a Boolean. So the very first time you run the app, we just ask the user. We don't show them why, right? But if they said no, and we have to ask them again, then this call will remember that the user was asked once, and this will return true. So then you know, okay, they've been already asked at least once, and they said no. And then you can do a little bit more. You can pop up them a dialog box saying, we really need those permissions because this part of functionality will not work, right? So you don't need to store this Boolean flag inside the app. It is kind of handled by the permission system. Yeah. Okay. So here we go. So we started the app, and as we were describing the flow, the app is asking us to allow or disallow, right? So if I deny, this will not change. It will still say hello world, right? So I could do that, and then nothing happens. And then if I run the app again, it will start again with this, right? If I run the app again, and I've previously said deny, the other call would return true, right? But we're not handling it. We actually always just asking without giving the explanation, right? So if I say allow, and I go to sensors. So I have location and I have the altitude. If I say, okay, 100 meters above the sea level, and I say send, you know, the altitude by GPS updates, right? So the whole thing works. It returns the environmental sensors and it reacts to updates of the GPS, right? The one thing that we haven't done is that it reacts to updates of GPS immediately for anything that happens, right? So any small variation of location and any small variation of altitude will trigger the new events for the GPS. Because we've set, so let me close that. Because here we've set minimum time and minimum distance, right? So, and what basically happens is we will get quite frequent updates from the GPS on the phone, right? We really don't want that. So we can say, so this is a minimal min time. Is it in seconds or is it in minutes? We don't know. We have to look it up, right? So let's go back to the yeah, what was that? Request location updates. I have to check what was the unit. Request location updates. Yep. Okay, so it's in milliseconds, right? So here we have to say how often do we want the updates, right? And then the second one is in meters. So if user hasn't, so they are both done together, right? So if we set 0 for one of them, it's kind of ignored, and then the other one is working. If we set 0 for both, then we get a lot of noise because the GPS is all over the place all the time. Every time the updates comes is in different location. So if you're standing still with your phone, it's not as if the GPS will report exactly the same location every single check. It will, move you around the point. So you will get sort of a random walk data, right? And also, how often do we need that? Do we need it? We have to answer that question ourselves. So what's the minimal time in milliseconds that we want the updates to happen? Is it like 1 second? Is it enough, or it's too much? For this app, I don't know, like once you get the reading, you really don't care. I mean, you don't change the altitude based on GPS that quickly, right? So it's a human scale. If you're walking, 30 seconds is fine, right? Depending what you're doing. Maybe an hour is fine if you're hiking. So you put something here. So let's put 30 seconds. So if we put 30 seconds in milliseconds, so I need 30,000, right? And then minimal distance, how much the user should move. Again, 0 is not a good value. You should do something. So 5 meters. How much altitude is gonna change if you walk 5 meters around on X and Y? 10 meters, 100 meters. So again, we're having some magic constants here, right? So we really should have like a minimum distance and minimum update time. If you're using minimal distance, you don't really care about the minimum time anymore, right? Because if I say I don't want updates to be more frequent than when the user moved 100 meters, then the first parameter we can safely ignore, right? So we can just say min dist. So if we say min dist and we say we have some sort of a private final, no, it has to be private final. Was it a float or double? Float min dist, and we said 50 meters. Yep, it didn't complain. It liked the float. So then we will get GPS updates every time a user changed by at least 50 meters, right? So if I go back here, oh no, I have to restart. So if I redo this, and I say, so the user is, yeah, let's send, right? So I'm sending a new update of GPS, and I've changed the altitude, but it didn't change my location. And you see that the GPS doesn't update, right? It says, well, those events are not actually calling back my callback. But if I move myself, you know, slightly by 1 degree, and send that, suddenly it updated, right? But I have to move at least by 50 meters. If I don't move, well, I moved way more than 50 meters. But you get the idea, right? So the GPS will get some updates, but it will not call me back. All right, so that's it. Any questions about this? I don't like the fact that the IDE is complaining about me doing stuff here. But it cannot work out that I got the permission, right? Because it can only work out that I got the permission if I do this if statement before that. And I'm not gonna do this if statement before that because this is a callback from returning me this, right? I can suppress this by doing this check. So I could do this. In which case the ID will be happy and will say, yeah, that's great. Then, you know, I have, or I could do this.
You can just skip the grunt results at all because it stays in the systems. So you don't need to check it here for what was the result.
Yeah, I know, but that's what the API is. Exactly. I see what you're saying. So what I could do is I could just basically do this.
No request code.
And don't check any of those parameters that I'm getting. But that's kind of stupid, isn't it? Yeah. So, and in that case, yes, no, ID is not complaining about me doing it here because I have this if statement before that. Yeah, I'm missing a bracket somewhere. If this one, I don't need that one. Yes. Good. So now it's all good, and the code smells now differently, right? It still kind of smells. It's not the right thing to do at that spot. I should be checking what I got here. Semantically, it is correct. It is still checking if I have the permission, right? But it doesn't feel right. I mean, yeah, so up to you. I mean, I like the first code more, but I don't really like the suppression. I don't like those warning suppressions. So I will opt for this option as Tomek suggested, but it's not ideal.
Could there be a case that the execution of the on-request permission results takes too long, so that hypothetically the user could already deny permission again before you access it? That's why you need to do an active check again.
That's a very far-fetched scenario. Well, so the scenario is that the user gets the pop-up, presses allow, and quickly goes to settings, says deny, and before my code hits that. Yes, it is possible. You don't know how long, yes, yeah, I agree. Yes. Yeah, valid point. Very unusual kind of race condition. But yeah, you could be right. So with the first if, this tells me, yes, you've been granted, but when I'm executing this, it throws a runtime exception saying, actually, you're not granted because the user in the meantime disabled the permission. But you have the same here, right? It's not an atomic operation. So between this if and executing that line, I still have a data race, right? Yeah.
But then if you just put this request permission again inside this if, then you could be ask again.
Yeah, that's right. So for example, if your app really cannot run without the GPS, right? And you probably have seen apps like that. They ask you for a permission, say deny, and they ask you again. Yeah, it's like deny again. Then you have to kill the app, right? Basically, and uninstall it. So yeah, you should not do that. You should ask the user. If the user says deny and you really need it, you should show this motivation, why you really need it. And then you should say, okay, then quit the app, right? So if the user says deny again, then after reading why you really need it, then you basically kill yourself. I mean, you don't kill yourself.
It's up to you.
All right. Yeah, it took us a little bit longer than expected. So let's have a short break, 5 minutes to 1:45, and then we will go back to the second part of the class.
The second part of the last 15 minutes.
Okay.
Would it be more worthwhile to think about the rationales how to request permissions? Because there may be a good reason to request for some permissions at the beginning,
Yeah.
and then additional optional permissions at runtime.
It's very domain specific. It's very application specific. What you really need and when you will ask it, right? So the rationale for the new permission system is that users were overwhelmed by a number of things they have to say yes to. And they developed a behavior of saying yes to everything the apps were asking, because otherwise the app will not install, right? So if I want to try something out, I cannot really even install the app if I don't say yes. And that leaves a very bad security paradigm, right? Because even though the mechanisms have the security built in, it doesn't work because the users always say yes without even reading it. So if I decided to install an app, then I will click yes, right? It's the same as with all those installers which ask you, do you agree to the terms of service or copyright agreements or whatever? You never read them. It's like, yeah, of course I agree. But you should read it technically, right? But nobody does it. So it was the same here. So Google said, okay, that's sort of bad design. We should really let users install the app and then tell them exactly in the context of what they are doing, what the permissions are for. And that's the current design, that if you really need to access a file, you can ask the user, okay, can the app access the file system because it just needs to store your high score or whatever that is, right? And the user says, oh yeah, I see why you're asking me for that permission. And then, oh, can you grant us the location because we need to calculate the altitude? Oh, okay, yes, right? But if you say, okay, can I have access to the file system, to the GPS, to the phone ID, whatever that is, then suddenly it's like, why do you need all of that, right? It's out of context. So the guideline basically with the permission is to ask the user for the permission in the context when that permission is needed. And if the user says no, tell them again why it is needed, right? And if you can live without this permission, on the second no, you try to live without that permission. But on the first no, you should explain the user why. And that's how it works. So technically, you should not ask user for anything upfront in the beginning. You should let them load the app and start the app and start using it. And the moment you really need something, like you need access to contacts or you need access to file system or you need access to the location, then you should do that, right? With this simple app, well, there is no context. I mean, the app is so dumb, so simple that everything is in the front screen. So you ask for everything up front, right? Because otherwise that makes no sense. But if we had two activities, one was, let's say, showing the pressure and the other one was showing two altitudes, then the first one could work with no asking for anything. And then you go to the other one and then the other one asks, right?
Can be misused because permissions will give me all the context because I need to calculate the altitude. It's still can be misused.
Yeah, it can be misused, but the user at least is more in the context of what is happening, right? So then the original model was really a big security hole because nobody was reading all those permissions and people were just saying yes, right? And there were some studies saying, okay, will those apps really need all those permissions? And most of the time, from the functionality point of view, you don't, right?
think there's also a new self-regulated element because now you need to get next user for each permission. So, you know, as
That's
opposed to
right.
having the bulk inquiry, which
Yes.
is like, give me all, one click, you're done.
That's right.
Supposed to having 20 clicks to now have the same level of access, right?
Exactly, it's more granular. And also, the user can disable the permissions later, afterwards, right? So the users are more in charge. And
there's also management of your how much permissions you actually want, because if you ask for 10 permissions, I will uninstall your app, irrespective of what you've done, really, because that's just it's not acceptable, right? So the developer needs to be more conscious as opposed to just go with the free for all.
Exactly, that is correct. Unfortunately, as I was explaining, that change happened with Android 6. And some developers will compile the app with the older APKs so that all the permissions are done up front, so they don't deal with it. And Google was sort of phasing out. I'm not sure what the status is today because I was not updating my APK on the Google Play, but they basically were saying there will be a deadline where people cannot publish apps with the older compilers because of those features, right? You have to, even if you're supporting older APKs, you still need to compile your app with the later one. So then the checks are kind of dynamic. Yep.
You mentioned in your code you should have camel case where it's relevant and you know, other coding conventions where they're in their appropriate
Yep.
locations. But you mentioned, just kind of on a quick note, that in XML it doesn't really matter. You should always, well, I mean, it does matter. You should always be lowercase. Why exactly?
No, so XML is case sensitive, normally. But if you go to the Android, you see that the case sensitive elements are only the ones which are related to the type of the classes, which are sort of naturally related to Java. Java is camel case based. So all the conventions in Java world are camel case. So text view is camel cased. You see that here, right? But if you see all the properties, they kind of mixed, right? So most of things are lowercase. So, you know, this is not camel cased. Android layout width, Android layout height are not. Text sizes is inconsistent, right? So within the XML for the layouts, historically, when it was kind of simple, it was dash based. It was not camel based. Most things were lower letters. But at the moment, it's kind of inconsistent. So it is up to you, really, right? So here in XML, you can do what you want. I tend to stick to the underscores in the XML. Just no real reason, right? In Java, you should stick to camel case because that's the typical convention. Here you can mix, and people, you see here, you know, layout constraints, bottom to bottom off. Well, it gets a bit complicated. Some bits are camel case, some bits are, you know, not. So, your call.
Another question.
Yep.
You would think Google would have standardized the request codes and return codes from doing operations. Why is that, like, to specify which code means okay? I mean, wouldn't you assume 0 means okay? Is there a reason why you can change that? How?
Yes, so in the ideal world, it would be standardized. Unfortunately, the Java and Android libraries are quite big, and there are different teams working on different parts. And there are some inconsistencies, for example, in the Java collection framework itself. Some things are called length, some things are called size. Sometimes you say get size, sometimes you say size, right? It's all over the place. Why? Well, because different teams were consistent within the team, but between the teams, there was no coordination. And once they kind of publish it, they really don't want to break backwards compatibility, and they never really clean things up. So unfortunately, you're right, they should be kind of a consistent naming, which they do occasionally. So they do deprecate things. So for example, with the fill rob content and fill parent, those are constants, and they changed the one to be match parent. instead of fill parent, right? So here we see match parent now. The fill parent became obsolete, and they kind of changed the values of what the constants were so that it's more consistent now, right? So some things may get deprecated and cleaned up, but it's just the nature of the large software projects that things get a little bit out of sync with each other. Yeah. Any other questions? So coding conventions in XML are not very strict. As you see it's yourself here, it's all kind of all over. Because I started using Android back, early, I was exposed to those underscores, and I kind of tend to use the underscore-based notations. But there is no real reason why you couldn't use a camel case. In Java, on the other hand, you should be strict about using the camel case. All right, so because we only have like 9 minutes and I cannot really discuss the Firebase, we will push the Firebase to Thursday, but I will give you a teaser, okay? I will give you a homework. So let's shut this down and let's just quickly discuss why do we need something extra. We have an Android framework. It works pretty well most of the time. So why do we need something extra? What is the typical use case for you developing a mobile app? So one is like with the sensor, which we just did, which you don't need anything else, right? So that's one use case. The use case is the app is self-contained. It's a game or it's some sort of utility app, and it runs and it's fine. But even if you're doing a game and you want to have a high score and you want to compare yourself to some other players, what do you need? Yeah? Exactly. You need some sort of backend. You need some sort of a database, right? So one use case is you have your client side and you have your app, and then the app is installed on multiple people's phones, and you have some sort of a database, some sort of backend which coordinates some data centrally, right? But to serve this database, you have to have some server, right? So that's one use case. You often need a server to store something between different instances of the app. What's the other one? So one is, okay, you have some server with a database. What else do you typically need? Or not typically, but sometimes need? Good. Interactions between users. So you need some sort of messaging, right? You want to let user or let the server or let the user to the server do some sort of messaging, right? You want to notify, okay, there is an update. You want to send something saying there is an update. You have new emails, fetch them, right? So push notifications or messaging, right? So that's the second use case. What's the third one? We already mentioned it. We already said users, right? Who is managing users? What it means to be a user, right? So the third one is, managing logins and users, authentication. So even if you have a database, you have to prevent, you have to have some sort of authentication happening so people don't mess up with each other's stuff, right? I cannot override your high score. I can only modify my own high score, and so on and so forth, right? So you have those three, which a lot of apps will need. A lot of apps will need one of those or all of them, right? So then you can do it yourself. You can develop a PHP backend to host a MySQL database and do the first one. When you are faced with messaging, you're like, okay, how I'm gonna do that, right? That's hard to do yourself. You have to rely on some existing infrastructure. And if you're developing for Android, naturally Google has the infrastructure which interacts with all the instances, so you can push stuff to users. So you have to rely on something. it's really hard for you to build it from scratch. And then authentication and user management, users like you yourself, you don't like creating new users for yourself. You've been user on Facebook and Google and things like that, and oath became kind of a de facto standard. So we reuse the tokens and we reuse some of the authentications. And there is a natural tendency not to burden the user with authentications. So on Android, everybody will have Gmail because you cannot install anything if you don't have a Gmail account, right? So if you need to manage users, naturally you may say, well, let the user be the actual Gmail user which you have on the Android, right? So if you're developing a game, you have the kind of play game services which will use your Android user as the user, and then your app can kind of benefit from it. So Firebase kind of fits in. It is infrastructure which does all those three things for you without you needing your own server and your own database. You don't need any of that. You can kind of just rely on the Firebase and treat it as a service and focus on the logic and on the app itself. So this is the kind of the very quick gist of what Firebase is. And Firebase additionally adds two more things. So one is analytics. So keeping track of the events in your app, in similar fashion as Google Analytics. It will kind of manage things for you if you need to. And the other one is, ads. So if you need to have a freemium model for your app and you want the app to be free, but you want to get some revenue from ads, it kind of adds that as well. So it is kind of like an integrated package. You don't need to use all of it. You can only use some of it. And what we will use, we will focus on the database and on the authentication. We will not do the messaging, which was mentioned second, and we will not use any of the other features, but they are available. You can look it up and you can use them yourself. But in the class, we will only focus on the usage of the kind of client cloud-based database storage for you, for your app, managing the permissions and managing the users. So we will do the authentication and the database. So on Thursday, I will kind of go over some of the setup and some of the configuration and some of the concepts which are behind the way authentication works with providers such as Google or Facebook, or email password-based authentication, and how you do that in Firebase. Firebase introduced this year two new things. One is that you can have anonymous users. So the user actually doesn't need to log in or authenticate, but Firebase will track a particular user from a phone or particular user from a web browser based on some cookies and based on some things that Google knows about without you really needing to log in, right? So you will be a unique user even though you haven't formally logged in. You will be kind of called anonymous user, and then you can have access to some of the resources as normal users have, but you will have an identity. So this identity will kind of allow you to have particular documents which are linked to you. And then later on, you can decide that I want to actually log in. I want to use my Google login. And then if you do log in with Gmail, this identity will be linked to your Gmail identity and all your documents will become yours, right? Even though you've been using this anonymous identity first. So that's one interesting one. And the other one is the phone-based authentication. You can provide a phone number and Google will do all the, Google with Firebase will do the handshake for you and ask the user for the SMS confirmation and stuff like that. And you can have sort of a phone number based authentication. So the user doesn't need to log in, just needs to provide a phone number of who they are. You probably have seen that in some apps, some messaging apps. They don't really ask you to create a new user, they just ask you what's your phone number. Like Messenger and Signal, they kind of work this way, right? So with Firebase, it's just a couple of lines of code and you can have it because Firebase does all the infrastructure for you. So yeah, so that's it. So we will do the some of the Firebase aspects on Thursday. Thank you.
person.